Hi, my name is Dan Ariely. I'm a professor of psychology and behavioral economics and the author of two books on these topics called Predictably Irrational and The Upside of Irrationality. And there's a recent book called Spousonomic. And Paula Schumann and Jenny Anderson, the authors of this interesting book, asked me to make some comments about my own married life. So I've been married for 12 and a half years. Actually, the reason I remember it's 12 years is because my last anniversary, I got Sumi a dozen eggs. I asked myself, what do you get for anniversary for 12 years? And the answer, of course, was a dozen eggs. Actually, these were wooden eggs, and I wrote a little word on each of them, and together they made a nice sentence, so it wasn't as bad. So, anyway, they gave me 5 questions that they wanted me to answer about dating and relationship. But before I answer this, let me just get dressed properly. Okay, so I think that now we're ready to talk about romance and dating. So the first question is getting married a rational thing to do? That's of course very hard to say because it depends on who you get married to, but I will say 2 things about it. One, it turns out it's a better deal for men than women in general. Men increase their happiness more when they get married, and women not as much, partially because in society women take more of the grunt of a married life and get less of the benefit. So that's one thing. The second thing that's interesting about marriage is that marriage is about the long-term relationship, but most people, of course, make decisions about getting married by short-term infatuations. And because of that, we see, of course, lots of divorce rate. Because when we think about marriage, we often think about what's good for us in the short term, and we assume that what's good for us in the short term would also be good for the long term, but the nature of relationship is not like that. Infatuation dies at some point, something else hopefully comes instead of it, and that's the question of transitioning from short-term relationship to long-term relationship. The second question is that spouses argue. It's the just natural thing to happen, and is there a better and worse way to argue? So here's the thing, people argue about lots of stuff. Often the argument is about other things. People just feel the need to argue, and there's some good advantages to arguing, by the way. Lots of people report that make-up sex is a wonderful thing to do, so there's some benefit for arguments. The thing about arguments, though, is that they can easily escalate beyond what we intend them to be. As people get in a bad mood and an angry mood, they start saying things that they wish they wouldn't have said later on, and what happens is there's escalation. So I think arguing is healthy and beneficial and useful. The issue is really how not to get it into spiral out of control, how not to say things we would regret, how not to leave the house, do other things that would have very dramatic consequences. So that's the issue. The third question they asked me is about the question of keeping doors open. People are often interested in many people, attracted to many people, especially in the dating process. You can imagine yourself dating multiple people. And the question is, how do we decide to commit to one person? In the experiments we have done, what we show is that if you can date 3 people, and they all promise you they can stay viable and you can keep on dating them, you very quickly pick one and just stick to that person. But if you date 3 people and 2 of them threaten you that unless you go and continue dating them, they will go away and find somebody else, we keep on revisiting those options. We have a very hard time to closing doors. And I think that weddings are basically that function. You know, I actually didn't believe that the wedding would make a big difference in how I feel towards Sumi, but it did. And I think the moment you made such a big, large public commitment, it does make a difference. You virtually close all other doors, and you commit to a relationship, and it actually does make things better. So we have this tendency to be vastly interested. I think commitment is actually a good way to define ourselves and basically commit to one direction. What has economics taught me about marriage, and what has marriage taught me about economics? I think economics has taught me very little about marriage. You know, in standard economics, marriage is really a production facility. It's about economies of scale, people living together, get better tax returns and distributing jobs between them. And I think that describes very little of married life. It describes some of it, but very little. And what marriage have described about economics is that economics is not a good description of human life. The fact is that marriage is really not rational. If you think about lots of stuff that we do in relationship, it's a vast description to think about them in rational style of economics. So having kids, being married, I think are all examples of the fact that rational economics is not what's ruling our life. And the last question was whether speed dating is a good idea. I actually love speed dating. And the reason I love speed dating is that when you go on online dating, the chances that somebody would actually return your email and you'll have a meeting is actually quite low. While in speed dating, people come, there's a limited set of people that you're going to see, and people in advance basically decide that they're going to say yes to some people. So the odds, even for somebody like me, is at the end of the day, you will meet somebody, they will be willing to go with you on a date. The odds just seems to be much better. The small set, people say yes to some of them, the odds are getting much higher for a second date. I will say one last thing about speed dating. A while ago we did some speed dating events for older individuals. This was not for romantic purposes, but it was for finding friends and maybe going for walks and so on. And the initial speed dating events didn't work so well. But what happened is that soon after, we asked people to bring something to the speed dating event that was important in their lives and use that as a catalyst for the discussion. And that was actually a fantastic success. We couldn't stop people from having those discussions. So basically, hope this is useful. Some reflection on spouseonomics. Take care.